Our first interview is with the project coordinator, Dr. Paula Harrison, who will give an overview of impressions. Paula is a senior research fellow at the Environmental Change Institute at the University of Oxford. So Paula, we hear a lot about climate change and projects that try to tackle this issue, but how is Impressions different and what is special about this project?
Okay, so the Impressions project is different to other climate change projects because it focuses on what we call high-end climate change. And by that, I mean climate change that involves temperature increases above 2 degrees. So you may have heard that the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change suggested that increases in global temperatures should stay below 2 degrees in order to avoid severe impacts. However, if you look at current trends in greenhouse gas emissions, these show that limiting global warming to this international target of 2 degrees is likely to be very difficult without radical emissions reductions. So even though high-end climate change is seeming to become more and more plausible, there's very few studies or projects that assess their potential impacts, and particularly very few that look at the ability of adaptation options to reduce those impacts and to lessen the vulnerability of society, and also to look at potential synergies and trade-offs between adaptation and mitigation. So what Impressions is trying to do is fill those gaps in knowledge, and we want to advance understanding on the consequences of high-end climate change and evaluate how that knowledge can then be useful and embedded within adaptation and mitigation decision making. So to do this, we're working closely with decision makers throughout our projects, and we're going to be undertaking a user needs survey through interviews with a whole range of decision makers to understand more about the issues and problems they face when trying to make decisions about complex and uncertain issues such as climate change, and also to find out what information tools and methods they need to overcome any barriers to making those important decisions. So underlying the whole project is the development of a set of high-end scenarios. These scenarios will cover both multiple scales, but they also integrate future changes in climate with changes in how social and economic conditions might progress and change right up to the end of this century. So these scenarios will include those related to high-end greenhouse gas emissions and the socioeconomic scenarios from the recent fifth assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They're known as the representative concentration pathways and the shared socioeconomic pathways. The scenarios will be determined through consultation with stakeholders and decision makers in a series of workshops, and that will ensure that those scenarios can be useful and credible, and that they'll encompass a whole range of different temperature increases going right up to 6 degrees, reflecting high levels of variability and uncertainty that might characterise high-end climate change futures. It's also important that they'll include the potential for non-linear effects and also like climate tipping points, such as ice sheet collapses, or socioeconomic shocks, such as large-scale migration of climate refugees. So those scenarios will then provide inputs to a wide range of climate change impact and adaptation models. And here we're really focusing the project on a set of 5 case studies, and those cover the global scale, the European scale, and 3 different regional case studies which are focused on Scotland, Hungary, and the Iberian Peninsula. And we have case studies covering all of those different scales because it's important to try and capture how boundary condition information might be important from one scale level to another scale level. So, for example, global and European trade often determines how much food might be imported into different countries, such as Scotland or Hungary. Now, we're also developing a range of different models for looking at climate change impacts and vulnerabilities. So these include more conventional types of impact models such as global and regional integrated assessment models and process-based models. But we're also developing new modelling approaches known as agent-based modelling, and these are more unique in that they take account of the behaviour of individual decision makers, firms and institutions that can then learn and interact with each other, and they allow us to more realistically simulate adaptation processes, particularly at regional and local scales. Another main focus of our modelling work will be to look at interactions between different sectors. So, for example, between agriculture, forestry and biodiversity, as they compete for resources such as land, water and energy. And cross-sectoral interactions are very important to include in climate change impact studies, because if you try and adapt in one sector, you might be very successful, but it could have serious consequences for other sectors that need to be taken into account. Our models will also be used to try and explore synergies and trade-offs between adaptation and mitigation actions. So this will include, for example, the potential for planting trees to alleviate both flooding as well as to store carbon and try to mitigate climate change. So then finally, all this knowledge that's been generated from the development of our scenarios and the application of our impacts modelling will be used to explore integrated solutions to the high-end climate change. And here we'll first look at the robustness of current policies and strategies to the high-end scenarios, and that will help us understand where there is a need for new policy approaches, particularly whether current policy approaches are able to deal with and cope with the extreme changes we expect under high-end climate change, or whether we need to look at policy transformation in order to adapt to these extreme scenarios. So we will be involving decision makers again in this part of the project in a second series of stakeholder workshops where we'll jointly develop adaptation and mitigation pathways for the high-end scenarios. And these will include possible mechanisms that can exploit the synergies and minimise conflicts as far as possible. So then we have a final stakeholder workshop in each of our case studies, and that then considers potential new integrated policy approaches for adaptation, mitigation and sustainable development under the high-end climate change. So what we hope is through this participatory approach, we should ensure that our project outputs meet the needs of those decision makers. That means that we can then help them to make long-term plans based on a full awareness of the climate risks, the adaptation limits and the mitigation opportunities.
So how many organizations participate in Impressions, and what is the project's lifespan?
Well, there are approximately 60 scientists involved in Impressions. It's a very large project. They come from 27 different research institutes in Europe. We also cover research institutes in Japan and the USA. And we're all working together on the project for 5 years. The project started in November last year, so we'll finish in October 2018.
And Impressions has two partnering projects. How is it planning to collaborate with them?
Yes, that's correct. So 2 other projects were funded under the same call for proposals as Impressions. So they also focus on high-end climate change, and they're known as the Helix and the Rises AM projects. And the Impressions partners are working very closely with these other 2 projects on a whole number of issues, and that ensures that we maximise our resources, and it also helps us assess the reliability of our conclusions. So in particular, we're collaborating over the development of a core set of high-end climate and socioeconomic scenarios, which means all 3 projects will report consistent results. We will also be jointly producing a common policy document with the aim that will be published before the revision of the EU adaptation strategy in 2017. We'll also link that with a joint dissemination event organised by the 3 projects to launch that policy document with the stakeholder community. So then the 3 projects are also working together on many other dissemination issues. So we're developing a a high-level web page for the 3 projects so that we can see the links between them and the different range of case studies being undertaken by the 3 projects. And we're also will be jointly organising the European Climate Change Adaptation Conference in 2017, and then there'll be a range of other outreach activities that we'll develop together as the projects progress, such as summer schools and journal special issues.
How do you see the benefits of the projects for society and nature?
Well, Impressions will explore the impacts of high-end climate change and the potential of adaptation options across a whole range of sectors. So they'll include agriculture, forestry, biodiversity conservation, tourism and health, water and energy and infrastructure, and also finance and insurance. We're also going to be dealing with multi-scale impacts such as trade and security and migration. Disaster risk reduction and humanitarian relief will also be considered in terms of looking at countries outside of Europe. So because we're including such a wide range of sectors and issues, there are likely to be benefits to very many sectors of society. And our main benefit will be in providing reliable scientific information on these very uncertain but potentially high-risk scenarios in the future that will inform the future policy development and adaptation planning across that wide range of sectors.
And lastly, how you're planning to make Impressions research resonate within society?
Well, stakeholder engagement and the participatory research approach are very central to the Impressions project. We've put a lot of effort into designing our stakeholder work to ensure that the decision makers with which we're going to be working throughout the project are as representative of different societal views as possible within the limitations of our resources. So this core set of stakeholders will be actively involved with us in co-creating the research with the project team. So that should ensure that all our scientific advancements are rooted in a thorough understanding of real-world adaptation and mitigation decision making. So as I mentioned earlier, we've got a decision maker needs survey that will take place at the beginning of the project. And then after that, stakeholders in each of our 5 case studies will be engaged in a series of 3 workshops to jointly develop the scenarios, the adaptation and mitigation pathways, and the resulting policy strategies with the research team. So in total, there are 15 stakeholder workshops involved in the project, and that should help ensure that our outputs resonate with society and are relevant to decision makers across Europe. And then finally, the project will build on that to try and address a much larger and long-term community of actively involved stakeholders. And we're doing that by developing an online knowledge network and information hub, and that should make the information from the project available in a wide range of usable formats and reach out to stakeholders and the wider public and other policymakers and researchers and innovators beyond the stakeholders involved in our workshops. We hope that will then support some mutual learning and help decision makers take up the project's recommendations.
Okay, Paula, thank you very much for your time, and it sounds like you've got exciting work ahead.
Thank you very much.